When a journalist tries to trap Caroline Leavitt on live TV, he thinks he has the upper hand. But what happens next? No one saw it coming. But before we dive in, let me know in the comments where you're watching from. The cameras rolled. The audience watched in anticipation. Ethan Caldwell, a seasoned journalist, adjusted his tie, his smirk barely concealed. Across from him sat Caroline Leavitt, press secretary for President Trump, her posture composed, eyes sharp. Ethan thrived on cornering conservatives. Tonight he had his target. His plan? Make Caroline stumble, force a contradiction, create a viral moment. Ms. Leavitt, he began smoothly, the administration labels every undocumented individual a criminal, even those with no violent offenses. Do you stand by that? It was a carefully laid trap. If she softened, it would seem like she was backtracking. If she stood firm, he'd paint her as ruthless. Caroline didn't hesitate. She tilted her head slightly. Ethan, are you saying breaking federal law isn't a crime? A pause. The audience shifted. Ethan blinked. Well, he said, clearing his throat, crossing illegally is technically a civil offense. Caroline cut in, her voice even. It's a violation of federal law. We don't get to redefine words just because it's inconvenient. The energy in the room shifted. Ethan's smirk wavered. His opening strategy had failed. He pushed forward. But these people are just seeking a better life. Caroline nodded slightly. Intent doesn't erase illegality. If it did, tax fraud wouldn't be a crime either. But it is. Ethan forced a chuckle. Not every undocumented immigrant is dangerous. Caroline met his gaze. Ethan, do you lock your front door at night? A flicker of confusion crossed his face. Of course. She leaned back. Why? Not everyone walking in would be dangerous, but you still lock it, don't you? Silence. Ethan had no comeback, and the cameras kept rolling. This was just the beginning. Ethan shifted in his chair. That wasn't supposed to happen. He had expected Caroline to fumble, to soften her stance, maybe even backpedal. Instead, she was in control. He cleared his throat. All right, Ms. Leavitt, let's talk about priorities. ICE arrested over 1,100 undocumented immigrants this week, and nearly half had no prior criminal record. If the goal is to remove violent offenders, why target those who haven't committed other crimes? It was a strategic move. He wanted to make her look ruthless, like the administration was indiscriminately tearing families apart. He leaned in slightly, expecting hesitation. But Caroline didn't hesitate. So, Ethan, let's be clear. They did commit a crime. The first crime was crossing illegally. The second? Ignoring the law and staying. The audience murmured. Caroline let the moment settle before continuing. If someone sneaks into a concert without a ticket, should they be allowed to stay just because they haven't stolen anything? She tilted her head. If someone bypasses TSA and boards a plane, do we let them go because they didn't hijack it? Ethan blinked. That wasn't the answer he had prepared for. Caroline pressed on. Laws don't work on a pick-and-choose basis, and immigration laws exist for a reason. Every sovereign country enforces them. Why should America be any different? Ethan forced a chuckle. But some industries rely on undocumented labor. Won't mass deportation hurt the economy? Caroline's expression remained calm. Oh, so now we're admitting illegal immigration undercuts American workers. She arched an eyebrow. The same people pushing for fair wages suddenly don't mind businesses exploiting cheap labor? The audience reacted. Ethan's fingers curled slightly around his cue cards. He had to regain control. Well, shouldn't violent offenders be the priority? Why not separate the criminals from those who are just undocumented? Caroline didn't miss a beat. Ethan, if law enforcement raids a building and finds 100 illegal immigrants, 70 of whom have criminal records, do we just let the other 30 go and come back later? She shook her head. That's not how law works. Every one of them broke the law, and that means they're subject to deportation. Ethan exhaled slowly. The plan was unraveling. He had tried sympathy, economics, and law enforcement, but Caroline was 3 steps ahead. She leaned in slightly, voice steady. Every country has the right to enforce its borders. Pretending otherwise? That's just political theater. The studio fell silent. Ethan swallowed hard. This interview wasn't going as planned. And Caroline? She was just getting started. Ethan took a measured breath. He was losing control, and he knew it. Caroline wasn't just answering questions. She was dismantling his arguments in real time. He needed to change tactics, and fast. He glanced at his notes, then looked up, adopting a concerned expression. Ms. Levitt, the administration's policies have sparked a lot of controversy. There are families being separated, people being deported after years of living here. Does the White House have any sympathy for these people? There it was, the emotional angle. Ethan was done arguing the law because he had lost that fight. Now he was shifting to feelings, hoping to make Caroline look cold, heartless. He leaned back, satisfied. Surely she wouldn't have a clean way out of this one, but Caroline was ready. Ethan, let's talk about sympathy. You care about families being separated? She nodded. So do we. That's why we're stopping the policies that encourage illegal immigration in the first place. The audience stilled. Ethan's confident smirk flickered. Caroline continued. Every time an administration refuses to enforce the law, it sends a message. Come in illegally, nothing will happen. And what's the result? More people take that risk. More families are put in danger. More kids are smuggled by cartels. She paused. That's not compassion, Ethan. That's enabling. The crowd murmured. Even some of the skeptics in the audience seemed to be reconsidering. Ethan knew he had to interrupt, regain control, before she turned this into her narrative. But deporting people who have lived here for years... Caroline raised a hand slightly. Not rude, just firm. A signal. Let me finish. We have legal immigration for a reason. Millions of people do it the right way. They wait. They follow the process. Are you saying their patience, their respect for our laws means nothing? Ethan opened his mouth, then shut it. Caroline pressed on. Think about it. If someone skips the line at an amusement park, do they get to stay because they've been in line long enough? Number rules apply to everyone, or they mean nothing at all. The audience applauded. Ethan's jaw tightened. This was not the interview he had planned. Caroline let the reaction settle before delivering her final point. America has borders for a reason. Enforcing them isn't cruel. Ignoring them is. Ethan looked to his producer. He needed a new strategy, fast. But deep down, he knew. Caroline wasn't just winning the argument. She was winning the audience. Ethan tapped his pen against the desk. He had tried legal arguments. He had tried emotional appeals. Neither worked. Caroline had countered every attack with logic, confidence, and precision. He needed to change the game. He forced a chuckle. Ms. Levitt, let's put immigration aside for a moment. There's been a lot of talk about the culture of this administration. Many say it's rigid, unwilling to compromise. You've defended these policies well, but do you ever feel like the White House should be more flexible? A clever pivot. He wasn't attacking policy anymore. He was attacking tone. If he could paint Caroline as too extreme, too inflexible, maybe he could weaken her credibility. But Caroline wasn't fooled. She met his gaze with the same steady confidence. Ethan, what exactly do you mean by flexible? Ethan hesitated. Caroline pressed on. Are you asking if we should ignore laws when it's convenient? Should we compromise on protecting American citizens? Should we back down because the media doesn't approve? The room fell silent. Ethan had walked right into her frame. He cleared his throat. No, I just mean, public opinion matters, and public opinion suggests some of these policies are unpopular. Caroline tilted her head slightly. Unpopular with whom? The media? Political elites? Because the American people, the ones who voted for President Trump, seem to support them just fine. The audience stirred. Ethan's smirk wavered. Caroline leaned forward slightly, voice calm but firm. Here's the truth, Ethan. Leadership isn't about chasing approval. It's about doing what's right, even when it's hard, even when it's criticized, even when journalists like you try to twist it into something else. The audience clapped. Ethan shifted uncomfortably. Caroline sat back, letting the reaction settle. You know what's ironic? The same people who tell us to be flexible never demand that from the left. When Democrats push radical policies, are they ever asked to compromise? She let the question hang for a moment. Or is it only conservatives who are told to soften their stance? Ethan clenched his jaw. He had lost control again. Caroline continued, "We're not here to play popularity games. We're here to fix the country. And fixing things means making tough decisions, whether the media likes it or not." The audience erupted in applause. Ethan glanced at his producer. This was slipping away from him. He needed a new angle, and fast. Ethan's frustration was becoming harder to hide. Caroline wasn't just answering his questions. She was turning them against him, forcing him to defend the very contradictions in his arguments. He needed to shift the focus. Fast. He straightened his papers, adopting a more casual tone. "All right, Caroline, let's step back from policy for a moment. Let's talk about the messaging, the administration's stance on immigration, the economy, and even faith. It's all framed in very black and white terms. Don't you think that's part of the problem? That this administration refuses to acknowledge nuance?" This was a familiar tactic. He wasn't attacking her position this time. He was attacking her style. If he could make her seem rigid, unwilling to engage in nuance, he could paint her as too extreme for mainstream America. Caroline took a measured breath. "Ethan, let's talk about nuance, because what I've noticed is that it only ever applies to one side." Ethan frowned. "What do you mean?" Caroline leaned slightly forward. "Well, when the left pushes open borders, it's compassion. When we enforce immigration laws, it's cruel." She let that hang for a moment. "When the left raises taxes, it's necessary for equity. When we cut taxes, it's favoring the rich." Another pause. "And when the left brings faith into politics, it's freedom of expression. But when conservatives mention God, it's suddenly dangerous mixing of church and state." The audience reacted, a mix of murmurs and scattered applause. Ethan shifted uncomfortably. He had wanted to frame her as too rigid, but now she was exposing the media's own double standards. Caroline continued, her tone even. "So let's be honest, Ethan. When you say we lack nuance, what you really mean is that we refuse to play the media's game." Ethan forced a smile. "I'm just saying, some people feel that this administration doesn't leave room for discussion." Caroline didn't blink. "Ethan, we discuss, but discussion doesn't mean surrendering our values. And let's be real. Whenever a conservative tries to discuss anything, what happens? The media shames them, mocks them, calls them extreme." The audience was fully engaged now. Some were nodding, a few were clapping. Ethan felt the shift in the room. He was losing them. He pushed forward. "But don't you think strong rhetoric divides the country even more?" Caroline smiled slightly. "Ethan, the country was divided long before President Trump took office. The difference is, he stopped pretending otherwise. The reaction was immediate. Applause, agreement, a few cheers." Ethan looked toward his producer, but there was no help coming. He had lost this round. And Caroline? She was just getting warmed up. Ethan needed a way out. Every argument he had thrown at Caroline had crumbled. He had tried legal loopholes, emotional manipulation, and even questioning her confidence. Nothing worked. He needed a new angle. "All right, Caroline," he said, carefully masking his frustration. "Let's talk about the economy. President Trump promised to lower costs for Americans, but his executive orders cutting regulations, aren't those just benefiting corporations while leaving working-class families behind?" He smirked slightly, thinking he had her this time. After all, wasn't it always easy to paint conservatives as favoring the rich? Caroline didn't take the bait. Instead, she fired back immediately. "Ethan, let's talk about what regulations actually do. Do you know how much Biden's regulations have cost the average American household?" Ethan hesitated. $55,000. A murmur rippled through the audience. Some leaned forward. The number landed like a shockwave. Caroline pressed on. "Over the past 4 years, American families have lost $55,000 to government overreach. Not because of new taxes, but because of excessive regulations. Biden didn't just raise prices. He let Washington bureaucrats drain people's wallets without them even knowing." Ethan shifted, trying to recover. "But deregulation helps big businesses, not everyday Americans." Caroline shook her head. "No, Ethan. Cutting regulations means lower energy costs, lower grocery bills, and more jobs. That's why President Trump signed an executive order declaring a national energy emergency, because high energy prices drive inflation. The audience reacted. The logic was simple, powerful, undeniable. Ethan exhaled, gripping his cue cards. So you're saying Trump's plan is just deregulate everything? Caroline smiled slightly. I'm saying Trump's plan is to put money back in Americans' pockets. Instead of forcing them to fund ridiculous government overreach, he's letting them keep what they earn. Scattered applause broke out. Ethan's smirk disappeared. For the first time that night, he looked to his producer. He needed to change the subject, fast, because if Caroline kept going, she wouldn't just win the debate. She'd completely expose the game. Ethan's frustration was barely concealed now. He had tried everything: legal traps, emotional arguments, tone policing, and economic skepticism. Nothing had worked. Every time he thought he had Caroline cornered, she flipped the narrative and left him scrambling for his next move. He needed to slow her momentum. With a forced smile, he leaned back in his chair. Okay, Caroline, let's put policy aside for a moment. Let's talk about optics. Even if we assume these policies are effective, they come across as divisive. Don't you think the rhetoric coming from the administration is hurting the country? Shouldn't the White House be less confrontational? This was his reset button. If he could make Caroline seem too combative, too extreme, he could steer the conversation away from facts and into perception. He wasn't debating policies anymore. He was debating how they made people feel. Caroline saw it immediately, and she wasn't going to let it slide. Ethan, let me ask you something, she said, her voice calm but sharp. When Democrats push extreme policies, do they ever get asked to tone it down? Ethan blinked. Well, that's not... Caroline held up a finger. Not interrupting, just holding the floor. When Democrats call for defunding the police, is the media worried about rhetoric? She let the question hang for a moment. When they push open borders and call ICE fascists, do you ask if that's divisive? The audience was dead silent. Ethan knew what was happening. She had flipped his argument against him. Again. Caroline pressed on. Let's be real, Ethan. Divisive is just a word the media uses when conservatives fight back. The audience reacted. A few cheers, a few claps. Ethan stiffened in his seat. Caroline continued. This administration isn't here to play nice with the press. We're here to fix the country. If that means upsetting journalists, so be it. Ethan swallowed, trying to regain his footing. So you're saying you don't care about unity? Caroline smiled slightly. I care about results. Applause erupted. Ethan glanced at his producer. He was running out of angles. And Caroline? She was just getting started. Ethan could feel the pressure mounting. His usual tactics, framing conservatives as too extreme, too rigid, too unfeeling, weren't landing. The audience wasn't turning against Caroline. If anything, they were leaning in, captivated by the way she was dismantling every one of his talking points. He needed a new angle, something bigger. Adjusting his tie, he adopted a more serious expression. Let's talk about national security. The administration recently cut security funding for former officials like John Bolton and Mike Pompeo. These individuals have been targets of credible threats, especially from Iran. Doesn't this decision put their lives at risk? This was a calculated move. If Caroline defended the cuts, she would look reckless. If she backtracked, she'd seem inconsistent. Either way, Ethan saw an opening. But Caroline had expected this. She took a measured breath, then met Ethan's gaze. Ethan, the American people are not responsible for paying for lifetime security for former government officials. Ethan blinked. He had anticipated a defensive answer, not a direct rejection of the premise. Caroline continued. These individuals serve their country, yes, but there is a difference between providing security for active threats and handing out indefinite taxpayer-funded protection. She glanced at the audience. Do you know who actually needs protection? The American people, the families who are dealing with rising crime, unsecured borders, and a government that prioritizes elites over its own citizens. The crowd stirred. Ethan tried to interject. But Iran... Caroline held up a hand slightly, keeping control. Ethan, let me remind you, these individuals are private citizens now. They have every right to hire security teams, just like any other high-profile figure. But why should hardworking Americans be forced to fund their protection for life? Ethan inhaled sharply. That was the real question, wasn't it? Caroline pressed on. This administration believes that taxpayer dollars should go to the people, not the political class. We will always prioritize national security, but we will not fund Washington insiders who can afford to take care of themselves. The audience erupted in applause. Ethan looked toward his producer. He was out of lifelines. Caroline wasn't just answering his questions, she was exposing the game itself. Ethan was running out of angles. Every attempt to corner Caroline had backfired spectacularly. She wasn't defensive. She wasn't flustered. She was turning every one of his arguments against him. And now the audience wasn't just watching, they were agreeing with her. He gripped his cue cards, scanning for something, anything that could shift the power dynamic. Then he saw it. A smirk returned to his face. All right, Caroline, let's talk about loyalty. You've built your reputation on being a voice for the working class, but now you're sitting here defending a billionaire president. Don't you see the irony? It was a classic attack. Paint her as a sellout, a mouthpiece for the wealthy. If he could make her seem disconnected from regular Americans, he might finally regain control. But Caroline had heard it all before. She leaned back slightly, tilting her head. Ethan, that's interesting because where I come from, we judge people by their character, not by how much money they have. The audience reacted. Ethan's smirk faltered. Caroline pressed on. You want to talk about irony? Let's talk about who's really looking out for the working class. She gestured toward him. You and your colleagues in the media spend more time attacking President Trump than you do exposing the policies that actually hurt American families. Ethan stiffened. He tried to interject, but Caroline wasn't done. Under Biden, inflation soared, gas prices skyrocketed, and wages couldn't keep up. But instead of questioning his failures, you're sitting here trying to convince people that the real problem is a billionaire who actually fixed the economy once before and is doing it again. The crowd applauded. Ethan gritted his teeth. His carefully laid trap had been shattered in seconds. Caroline gave a small smile. Ethan, the real question isn't about Trump's wealth. It's about who's fighting for the American people. And I think we both know the answer. The audience's thunderous applause left no room for doubt. Ethan had lost another round. And Caroline, she wasn't slowing down. Ethan was losing ground fast. His usual tactics, emotional appeals, media narratives, attempts to paint Caroline as extreme, had all failed. She wasn't just answering his questions, she was exposing the flaws in them. But he had one more card to play. He took a breath, lowering his voice slightly, as if shifting to a more serious tone. Caroline, let's talk about your transformation. You were once critical of certain aspects of the Trump movement. Now you're one of its most vocal defenders. What changed? Or should I say, who got to you? There it was. Not an attack on policy, not an attack on Trump, an attack on her integrity. If he could make her look inauthentic, like she had sold out for power, he could discredit everything she had said so far. But Caroline didn't even blink. She tilted her head slightly, a small smile forming. Ethan, are you suggesting that changing your mind based on facts is a bad thing? Ethan hesitated. I just mean, Caroline leaned in, because last time I checked, that's called growth. The audience reacted. Ethan's lips pressed into a thin line. Caroline continued, her tone steady. When I was younger, I saw things differently, but then I saw what actually worked. I saw policies that put American families first. I saw the media lie over and over, and I realized something. The problem wasn't Trump. The problem was the system trying to destroy him. The crowd murmured in agreement. Ethan tried to cut in. So you're saying... Caroline didn't let him. Let me ask you something, Ethan. She paused, letting the moment stretch. Have you ever changed your mind about something important? Ethan swallowed. Caroline smiled. Or is that only acceptable when it benefits your side? The audience erupted in applause. Ethan clenched his jaw. He had tried to question her loyalty, her authenticity. Instead, she had just proved why she was more genuine than any politician in Washington. And once again, he had lost control. Ethan's grip tightened around his cue cards. He had thrown everything at Caroline. Legal arguments, emotional traps, accusations of hypocrisy. None of it worked. She had turned every attack into a counteroffensive, leaving him scrambling to keep up. He needed to change the tone. Fast. He forced a chuckle, trying to reset the conversation. All right, Caroline, let's put aside politics for a second. Let's talk about trust. The administration says it fights for the American people, but millions feel left behind. How do you expect everyday Americans to trust this White House when so many feel like Washington is rigged against them? It was a smart pivot. He wasn't questioning her facts anymore. He was questioning her credibility. If he could make her seem like just another politician, detached from the struggles of regular Americans, he could undermine everything she had built in this interview. But Caroline was 3 steps ahead. She leaned back, folding her hands. Ethan, you're absolutely right about one thing. Washington is rigged, but not by us. Ethan blinked. That wasn't the answer he expected. Caroline continued. For decades, politicians on both sides have made promises they never kept. They told Americans they'd fix the economy, secure the border, and put families first. And they failed. The audience was silent, listening. She leaned in slightly. That's why people trust President Trump, because he actually did what he said he would do. He cut regulations, secured the border, lowered gas prices, and now he's doing it again. Ethan shifted uncomfortably. He tried to cut in, but Caroline didn't let him. You want to talk about trust? She tilted her head. The real question isn't whether Americans trust us. It's why they stopped trusting the media. The audience erupted in applause. Ethan clenched his jaw. He had tried to cast doubt on Caroline. Instead, she had just exposed him. And the worst part? She wasn't finished yet. Ethan felt the shift in the room. He had tried to corner Caroline, to make her seem detached from the struggles of everyday Americans. But instead, she had flipped it on him. Now the audience wasn't questioning the administration. They were questioning him. He needed to hit back, hard. He adjusted his tie, his tone sharpening. Caroline, let's be real. The economy isn't just about regulations and tax cuts. It's about people. And the reality is, under this administration's federal freeze, millions of Americans are worried about losing key assistance programs. How do you justify that? It was a direct attack on Trump's spending policies. If Caroline couldn't defend it, he could paint the administration as cold, out of touch, indifferent to struggling families. But Caroline didn't flinch. She knew this question was coming. She nodded slightly, then met Ethan's gaze. Ethan, I'm glad you brought that up, because I've been asked this question about 4 times already, and I'll give you the same answer. The audience chuckled. Ethan's smirk flickered. Caroline continued, her tone steady. The president has been crystal clear. Direct assistance to Americans is not being cut. Social Security, unchanged. Medicare, unchanged. Welfare benefits, unchanged. She glanced toward the camera. The only thing being paused is reckless government spending that does nothing but drive up inflation. The audience murmured in agreement. Ethan needed to regain control. But organizations that rely on federal funds, programs like Meals on Wheels, could see disruptions. Isn't that a problem? Caroline's response was immediate. So let me get this straight, Ethan. You suddenly care about accountability when it comes to spending? She tilted her head. Where was this concern when the last administration printed trillions of dollars, causing the worst inflation in decades? The crowd reacted. Ethan shifted in his seat. Caroline pressed on. Let's be honest. The media wasn't worried about wasteful spending when Biden was throwing money at Ukraine, green energy failures, and student loan bailouts. But now that Trump is cutting the fat, suddenly it's a crisis? The audience applauded. Ethan gritted his teeth. He had tried to frame Caroline as out of touch. Instead, she had exposed the hypocrisy of the entire argument, and he was running out of time. Ethan's frustration was boiling beneath the surface. Every time he tried to frame Caroline as out of touch, she turned the conversation back on him, back on the media, back on the establishment. And the worst part? The audience was with her. He needed a knockout punch. He straightened his papers and exhaled. Caroline, let's stop dancing around the issue. The reality is Trump's policies are controversial. His energy policies, his deregulation, his spending cuts, many say they're reckless, that they're destabilizing the economy. Does this administration even care about long-term consequences? This was his last play. Make her defend Trump's entire economic approach. If she stumbled, he could finally regain ground. But Caroline didn't stumble. She smirked. Ethan, you want to talk about consequences? Let's talk about the consequences of Biden's presidency. Ethan's confidence wavered. Caroline leaned in slightly. Under Biden, inflation skyrocketed, the economy slowed, and working Americans suffered. But you never asked his press secretary about long-term consequences, did you? The audience stirred. Ethan tried to interject, but Caroline wasn't done. You want to know why President Trump is rolling back regulations? Because in the past 4 years, Biden's policies have cost American households an extra $11,400 per year. That's food, gas, housing, all more expensive because of reckless spending. Ethan froze. He had walked into another numbers-based takedown. Caroline pressed on. So when you ask if we care about consequences, yes, we do. That's why we're fixing the mess. That's why we're making America energy dominant again. That's why we're cutting unnecessary regulations. Because the real long-term consequence is what happens when we let the left keep destroying this country. Thunderous applause. Ethan clenched his jaw. He had tried to force Caroline to defend Trump. Instead, she had forced him to answer for Biden. And once again, she had won. Ethan was running out of options. He had tried everything, questioning Caroline's integrity, attacking Trump's policies, framing the administration as reckless. None of it worked. The audience wasn't just watching anymore. They were rooting for Caroline. He needed a new approach, one that would rattle her, throw her off balance. He took a slow breath, feigning concern. Caroline, let's talk about values. The administration has been vocal about faith, about patriotism, about traditional American values. But isn't it dangerous to mix faith and government? Doesn't that alienate millions of Americans who don't share the same beliefs? It was a familiar attack. Frame conservatives as too religious, too ideological, make them look like they're forcing their views on the country. If he could make Caroline seem like an extremist, he could shift the narrative. But Caroline was ready. She met Ethan's gaze. Ethan, when I took this job, I placed my hand on a Bible. Every president in our history has done the same. Was that dangerous? Ethan blinked. Well, Caroline continued, when soldiers go into battle, they pray with their chaplains. When Congress opens a session, they begin with a prayer. Was that dangerous? The audience leaned in. Ethan had no answer. Caroline pressed on. You see, Ethan, faith isn't a threat to America. Faith built America. Our founding fathers weren't afraid of religion. They were afraid of tyranny. The audience erupted in applause. Ethan tried to recover. But in a diverse society, shouldn't the government remain neutral? Caroline smiled slightly. Neutral or hostile? Because let's be honest, the only faith that seems to be under attack in this country is Christianity. Ethan tensed. He could feel control slipping away again. Caroline leaned forward. No one complains when faith is used to promote progressive causes. No one objects when activists use moral arguments for climate change or social justice. But the moment a conservative talks about faith, it's suddenly dangerous. The audience roared with approval. Ethan clenched his jaw. He had tried to make Caroline look extreme. Instead, she had just exposed the double standard, and he had nothing left to say. Ethan was losing control faster than he could recover. Every argument, every narrative, every carefully planned attack had been turned against him. And the worst part, the audience knew it. His next move had to be calculated, something that could shift the focus away from his failures and back onto Caroline. He forced a smile. Caroline, let's talk about loyalty. The administration has been very vocal in its support for President Trump, even going so far as to call him God's instrument for America's renewal. Don't you think that's a bit extreme? It was a trap. If Caroline defended the statement outright, He could paint her as blindly devoted. If she walked it back, it would look like division within the administration. But Caroline didn't hesitate. She smirked. Ethan, what I think is extreme is how the media seems more concerned with a leader who prays than with policies that actually impact American families. The audience clapped immediately. Ethan stiffened. He had hoped for a stumble. Instead, he got a counterattack. Caroline continued. You want to talk about faith? Let's talk about the real story here. The story isn't that people of faith support Trump. It's why they do. Ethan's expression tightened. He tried to interject, but Caroline pressed forward. They support him because he keeps his promises, because he fights for them when the media mocks them, when Washington ignores them, when the establishment tells them their values don't matter. She turned slightly toward the audience. The real question isn't why we stand by Trump. It's why the media hates him so much. The audience erupted in applause. Ethan's fingers curled around his cue cards. He had tried to make Caroline defend Trump's faith. Instead, she had forced him to defend the media's bias. And just like that, he lost another round. Ethan could feel the walls closing in. Every question he had posed had been deflected and countered, leaving him with nowhere to go. The audience wasn't just watching, they were siding with Caroline. She had been in control from the start, and he was starting to realize there was little hope of shifting the tide. With a deep breath, he tried once more to find a line of attack. All right, Caroline, let's go back to something you said earlier about faith. I can see how important it is to you and to the president. But don't you think it's dangerous to say someone like Trump is God's instrument for America's renewal? Isn't that kind of a dangerous mindset for a public official? He had hoped this would rattle her. If Caroline clung too tightly to this idea, it could easily be painted as cult-like devotion. If she denied it, he could claim she wasn't being honest about her beliefs. But Caroline was prepared. She smiled slightly, a calmness in her demeanor that Ethan hadn't expected. Ethan, I think what's dangerous is the idea that faith has no place in leadership. Our country was built on the understanding that our rights come from God, not the government. The room grew still. Caroline's words landed, their weight sinking in. Ethan tried to respond, but Caroline kept going. You want to talk about dangerous mindsets? What's dangerous is when politicians and the media try to tell Americans that their faith, their values, and their beliefs don't matter in the public sphere. She paused for emphasis. That's a far greater threat to this country than any leader acknowledging the role of faith in their leadership. The audience responded immediately. Applause filled the room. Ethan's eyes darted to his producer. He could feel the energy in the room slipping away from him. Caroline's calm, assured response had disarmed him once again. He had tried to paint her as out of touch with American values. Instead, she had reaffirmed those values in a way that resonated with the people watching. Ethan leaned back in his chair, his mind racing for a way to recover. But Caroline wasn't finished. If we truly want to be a nation that respects freedom of speech, freedom of religion, and freedom of conscience, we can't pretend that faith is something to be hidden away or ignored. It's central to who we are as a country. The applause grew louder. Ethan had no words. Once again, Caroline had flipped the narrative. Ethan glanced toward his producer, who gave a subtle shake of the head. He knew this interview was over. And Caroline? She wasn't just winning the debate. She had completely turned the tables. Ethan's mind raced as he realized the battle was all but over. Every angle he had taken had been systematically dismantled by Caroline's sharp, unwavering responses. Her composure and ability to stay on message had left him scrambling. And the audience? They were on her side, fully engaged, clapping at every key point she made. He knew now that he couldn't afford to let this interview drag on much longer. With a forced smile, he leaned back in his chair and decided to take a different approach. One last time. He had to plant a seed of doubt. Caroline, you've been steadfast in defending the administration's approach to policy, but let's face it, the president has been under constant fire, whether it's about his relationship with foreign powers or his controversial statements. How do you respond to critics who say his rhetoric is more about division than unification? It was a classic move. Call out the divisiveness of Trump's rhetoric, force Caroline to either backtrack or double down. If she was too defensive, it would make her seem weak. If she was too firm, It could paint her as out of touch with the American people. Caroline didn't bat an eye. "Ethan, let me ask you a question," she said, leaning slightly forward, her tone calm yet authoritative. "Do you really believe America is more united now, under Biden's leadership?" Ethan's expression faltered. "Well, that's not the issue here." "No, Ethan, it's the issue," she interrupted gently but firmly. "Under Biden, we've seen skyrocketing inflation, rising crime rates, and an open border that's left American citizens vulnerable. Is that unity?" The audience stirred, murmurs rippling through the crowd. Caroline had shifted the focus again, forcing Ethan to defend Biden's leadership instead of challenging Trump. Caroline continued, voice steady. "President Trump didn't divide this country. What divided America was a system that allowed corruption to thrive, elites to flourish, and ordinary Americans to suffer. Trump came in as a disruptor, someone who would say the things no one else had the courage to say. That's why he was elected." The room shifted. The audience was leaning in, fully engaged with her words. Ethan's earlier tactic of accusing Trump's rhetoric of division had been flipped back on him. Caroline's expression was serene but determined. "Ethan, if we really want to talk about unity, let's start with the truth. If the media and politicians were truly interested in uniting this country, they would stop trying to tear down the values that have made America great. Instead, they'd focus on policies that actually help people, not just talking points that sound nice, but never result in action." The applause grew louder, and Ethan was silenced. Caroline had mastered the art of redirecting every attack, and now the audience wasn't just listening, they were rallying behind her. Ethan glanced down at his notes, trying to find some way to salvage the interview, but the realization hit him. He had lost. Caroline stood tall, unwavering in her convictions. She wasn't just defending the administration, she was redefining the debate. And as the applause continued to echo in the studio, Ethan knew he had been outmatched. Ethan sat back in his chair, his mind racing for one final way to regain control. Every attempt he had made to shake Caroline's composure had backfired. Each time he tried to expose cracks, she'd simply reinforce the strength of the administration's stance with clarity and confidence. The audience wasn't just engaged anymore. They were completely on her side. He realized then that he wasn't going to win this exchange, but there was one more card he could play. He could try to make Caroline look out of touch with the real struggles that Americans were facing. If he couldn't undermine her arguments, he could at least shift the narrative. With a slight sigh, he attempted one last shot. "Caroline, I can see how passionate you are about these policies, but you have to understand, there are millions of people who feel abandoned by this administration. They feel like they've been forgotten. How do you respond to them?" He wasn't asking about policy anymore. He was asking about empathy. If Caroline tried to defend the administration's record too strongly, he could accuse her of being out of touch with the struggles of everyday people. He was betting everything on this angle, but Caroline saw this for what it was, a last-ditch effort to trap her. She leaned forward, making eye contact with Ethan, her expression softening slightly. "Ethan, I get it. There are people who are struggling right now. But you know what? Those people don't need someone who'll tell them what they want to hear. They need leaders who will actually solve their problems." Ethan blinked, unsure of where she was going with this. Caroline continued. "And the truth is, the people who feel forgotten by this administration are the same people who've been ignored by Washington for decades. They've been told to wait their turn, to rely on government programs that never actually solve anything. And that's the problem." The audience shifted. They were listening. Caroline's words had struck a chord. President Trump has always been a voice for the forgotten man and woman, the people who've worked their entire lives and never got the help they needed from the government. We're not here to keep people dependent on a system that doesn't work. We're here to give them the tools they need to stand on their own 2 feet. The applause began slowly, but soon it was thunderous. Caroline wasn't just defending policies anymore. She was speaking to something deeper, a message that resonated with people who felt the system had failed them for too long. Ethan's face flushed. He had tried to play the empathy card, but Caroline had turned it into a powerful argument for self-reliance and real solutions. "Ethan," Caroline added with a slight smile, "we're not here to be popular. We're here to be effective. And if that offends people who want the system to stay broken, so be it. We're here for the people who want to see things change. The applause erupted. Ethan sat in stunned silence. Caroline had dismantled his final attempt to undermine her. And as the clapping continued, Ethan knew he had lost this interview. Caroline had not only defended the administration's policies, she had turned the tables and made him question his own framing of the debate. Caroline had won, hands down, and the audience knew it. Ethan was now clearly on the defensive. The interview had spiraled out of control for him, and despite his best efforts to regain the upper hand, Caroline had outmaneuvered him at every turn. The audience was no longer just reacting, they were supporting her. In an attempt to save face, Ethan leaned back in his chair, checking his watch as though the time was running out. His final move was going to be a last-ditch effort to regain control of the narrative. "All right, Caroline," he said, trying to regain some composure. "I think we've covered a lot of ground today, but let's wrap this up with one final question. With everything we've discussed, the border crisis, immigration, deregulation, the economy, there are still a lot of Americans who feel uncertain about the future. They're not just questioning the policies, they're questioning whether anyone in Washington actually understands what it's like for them. How do you respond to those people?" It was an obvious attempt to go for one final emotional appeal, to make Caroline seem out of touch with the very people she claimed to represent. If he could make her look disconnected from the struggles of everyday Americans, it might be his last chance to salvage this. But Caroline didn't blink. She smiled gently, then leaned forward slightly, locking eyes with Ethan. "Ethan, you're right about one thing. There are people who feel uncertain. But the question is, why do they feel that way?" Ethan furrowed his brow, a little caught off guard by the sudden shift. Caroline didn't give him time to respond. "The reason people feel uncertain isn't because of the policies that are being implemented now. It's because they've been lied to for so long. For decades, Washington has promised to fix the economy, secure the borders, help the working class, and failed." Her voice was steady, emphatic. "For decades, the American people have been sold the lie that government will solve all their problems, that it can tax and regulate its way to prosperity. But all it's done is put them further in debt and made their lives harder." The audience nodded in agreement. Caroline continued, "What President Trump understands is that real change doesn't come from government handouts. It comes from creating an environment where people can thrive on their own. You want to know why the American people are uncertain? Because they've seen Washington fail them over and over again. They've seen the system protect the elites and ignore the ones who need help the most." Ethan opened his mouth to speak, but Caroline raised a hand slightly, signaling that she wasn't finished. "But the president isn't trying to fix everything for them. He's giving them the tools to fix it themselves, to bring back their jobs, their security, and their faith in the future." The audience clapped again, the energy in the room unmistakable. Caroline had framed the question as a moment of empowerment, not pity. She wasn't just defending the administration's policies. She was invoking a vision of American strength and self-reliance. Ethan, now at a loss for words, glanced at his notes, but there was no escape. Caroline had turned the entire interview on its head, framing the narrative the way she wanted. And at that moment, Ethan knew this wasn't just a debate, it was a statement. The applause grew louder, and as the camera panned across the room, the reality was clear. Caroline had won. As the applause echoed through the studio, Ethan realized something. He wasn't just losing this debate, he was losing the room. Caroline's confident, sharp responses had made him look like a novice, and now the audience's support was firmly behind her. The cameras were still rolling, but Ethan's smile had become a tight, forced expression. He looked at Caroline, trying one last time to shift the tone. "Well, Caroline, I think we've gone over plenty of ground today. I'll give you the last word. Anything you want to say to the millions of Americans who are watching?" Caroline turned to the camera, her smile steady, her eyes piercing through the lens. "To the American people, I want you to know this. We're not here to make everyone happy. We're here to do what's right." Ethan's lips parted, but there was no chance to interrupt. Caroline continued, her voice calm but resolute. "For too long, Washington has been controlled by elites who don't understand your struggles, who don't care about your families. But we do. We're fighting for you, the forgotten men and women of this country. We're fighting for your freedom, for your rights, for your future. The crowd erupted in applause again. Ethan tried to speak, but the momentum was no longer with him. Caroline was in control, and every word she said resonated. She leaned in slightly, her expression unwavering. The fight is not over. It's just begun. And we will keep pushing, keep fighting for the war values that made this country great. The applause grew louder, almost deafening. Ethan's face was flushed. He looked at the producer, who had now turned his gaze toward the floor. He knew they had lost the narrative. Caroline stood up, her posture unshaken, and gave a small nod to the camera as she walked off stage. The audience was still on their feet, applauding her. Ethan sat back in his chair, his mind reeling. He had entered this interview thinking he could take her down, but she had redefined the entire conversation. The credits rolled, the cameras faded, and one thing was crystal clear. Caroline had not just won this battle. She had changed the entire game. Now, if you're watching this, and you believe in the values Caroline spoke about in the fight for the American people, then make sure to hit that like button, subscribe, and share this video with everyone you know. Don't let this message fade away. Join the movement, because America needs leaders who fight for us. God bless you, and God bless America.